The blizzard had nearly drowned her voice, yet the words still found him when he opened the door. I need shelter, and I will work for every breath you give me. For a heartbeat, Calder Brooks thought the storm itself had taken human shape. Snow clung to her hair in white shards, her dark Apache eyes half closed, fighting the cold that had already stolen the color from her lips. Behind him, the ranch house groaned under the winter wind, hollow as his own chest these past 3 years. She swayed. He caught her before the storm could reclaim her. Little Annie stood on the staircase clutching the rail, whispering, "Papa, is she dying?" Calder lowered the young woman to the floor near the fire, her breath shallow, her hands raw and trembling. She had walked through a Wyoming winter alone. No one survived that unless they were running from something worse. And as the flames lit her frozen face, Calder understood one thing with painful clarity. If he hadn't opened the door this very second, she would have died on his porch. Winter in Red Hawk Basin did not simply arrive. It claimed the land. The wind came first, sliding down from the jagged teeth of the Wind River Range, carrying with it the metallic scent of frozen earth. Then came the snow, thick and relentless, swallowing the valley in a silence so heavy it pressed against the windows of Calder Brooks's ranch like a living thing. In the faint glow of the hearth, the house felt too large, its empty corners echoing with a grief that had never settled since Margaret died. Calder moved with the quiet heaviness of a man who had learned to survive by routine. Dusty boots by the door, chopped wood stacked with strict precision, a pot of winter stew simmering on the stove, his one concession to what should have been Christmas Eve. Annie sat nearby cutting small pieces of paper, her tongue peeking from the corner of her mouth in concentration. It was something Margaret had taught her, back when winters had come with laughter instead of shadows. When Calder returned to the young woman lying near the fire, she no longer looked like a creature carved from ice, but she still looked breakable. Apache features softened by exhaustion, skin wind-burned, hair tangled with shards of frost. Her clothing, deerskin torn at the hems, bore the marks of a week spent wandering the wilds, with no shelter but instinct. Her eyes opened, dark, wary, intelligent, eyes that had learned to mistrust the world. She flinched at the sound of the wind rattling the shutters, then steadied herself with a long, slow breath. Calder noticed the talisman on her wrist, a small carved feather polished by time. It told him she came from people who believed in signs and cycles, in spirits moving through wind and fire. Annie, curious but gentle, crawled a little closer. "Papa says the storm is mean tonight," she whispered. The woman nodded. "Storms are spirits unsettled," she murmured, voice raw. Her English was accented but clear. "My name is Onatah." Calder introduced himself with a small nod, then hesitated before adding, "This land, it isn't kind to strangers." Onatah's gaze flicked to the door, as if considering the storm outside. "The land is kinder than men," she said softly. The words carried weight, too much weight for someone who should have been thinking only of warmth and survival. Calder didn't press her. He recognized the hollow places in others because he carried them himself. A scar at his jaw, faint but sharp, caught the firelight, a relic of the cattle raid that had taken Margaret's life and carved silence into him. Annie lived with a brightness dimmed but not extinguished, clinging to slivers of joy the way a child does when she believes sadness will pass if she just keeps hoping. The ranch house creaked again under the wind. Outside, the world was frozen and wide. Inside, 3 souls, one weary, one guarded, one quietly hopeful, faced each other in a fragile pool of warmth. Nothing about this night made sense, but everything about it felt like the beginning of something that had been waiting far too long. Onatah woke before dawn, roused by the crackle of settling embers and the faint sway of shadows across the ceiling. For a moment she wasn't sure where she was. The smell of pine wood, the softness beneath her cheek, the warmth on her skin, none of it belonged to the world she had known for the past 7 nights. Her hand shot to the talisman at her wrist. Still there, still hers. Only then did her breath loosen. But when she pushed herself up, the ranch house answered her movement with a wooden groan. Calder Brooks appeared almost instantly, boots thudding softly on the floorboards. He had the stance of a man accustomed to danger arriving in the quiet moments. Shoulders squared, gaze sharp even in half-light. "You shouldn't be standing yet," he said. Onatah steadied herself on the edge of the sofa, chin lifting with a pride that refused to bend even under exhaustion. "I do not lie down when I owe breath," she answered. Her voice held a rasp, but her meaning was clear. Calder regarded her silently, trying to place this woman who could barely walk, yet spoke like someone defending sacred ground. He handed her a tin cup of warm broth. She accepted it with 2 hands Apache custom. He realized and drank in slow, guarded sips. Behind them, Annie padded into the room, hair tousled, cheeks sleepy pink. She watched Onatah with open fascination, then whispered, "Papa, is she staying?" Onatah's eyes flickered, and the answer came quickly, too quickly. "Only until the storm ends." Calder didn't contradict her. The truth was, he didn't know what to offer, or what was right. He'd spent 3 years learning to live with just enough warmth, just enough food, just enough hope to keep Annie safe. Taking in a stranger, an Apache woman fleeing something unseen, felt like stepping into a river whose depth he couldn't measure. Still, he found himself asking, "Were you heading somewhere?" Onatah's gaze drifted toward the shuttered window. Snow still clung thick to the glass. "Away," she murmured, "just away." It wasn't an answer. It was a wound spoken aloud. Calder crossed his arms, leaning against the table. "Someone after you." Her fingers tightened on the cup. A bead of silence stretched thin. "Too thin. Storm found me before they did," she replied. He didn't like the sound of that, but pushing her would close the little trust she'd shown. So he simply nodded and said, "You're safe here." Onatah's head lifted sharply. "Safe!" She repeated it as if testing a foreign word, a taste she didn't know whether to accept or spit out. Her eyes searched his face, then Annie's. She did not smile, but something in her expression softened barely, like a thaw in the first sunlight. Annie crawled onto the bench beside Onatah and tugged at the torn edge of her deerskin sleeve. "I can sew this," the girl offered. Onatah blinked, surprised by the child's certainty. "You know how Margaret taught me," Annie said simply. The name passed through the room like a ghost brushing by. Onatah sensed the shift instantly, the tightening of Calder's jaw, the flicker of loss in Annie's eyes. She bowed her head with instinctive respect, though she didn't know who Margaret was, just that she mattered. Slowly, she placed the torn sleeve into Annie's hands. "Then I trust you," she said. It was the first real bridge built between them. Calder watched this exchange with something unfamiliar tightening in his chest. This was not how he imagined Christmas Eve, not with a stranger on his sofa, not with his daughter smiling again after months of quiet grief. He didn't know what the next hours would bring, much less tomorrow. But when Onatah lifted her eyes to his, dark and steady, despite the storm she'd endured, the room felt different. Spring did not arrive gently in Red Hawk Basin. It crept in slowly, melting the snow in stubborn patches and turning the ground into a thick, heavy mud that clung to boots and horse hooves alike. Yet even in its harshness, spring carried something winter did not, the promise of a beginning. By the time the drifts receded from the porch, Onatah was strong enough to move more steadily, though her steps still carried the cautious grace of someone used to reading the land rather than relying on it. One morning, she approached Calder as he sorted firewood outside. "I want to stay," she said plainly, "not as a guest. I will work for food and shelter. I do not need coin." Calder straightened, taken aback by the clarity in her voice. "People here earn wages. My people earn belonging," she answered. "I asked for a place to sleep and a way to repay that." Her words were neither begging nor bargaining. They were a declaration of dignity. He studied her for a long moment. The storm had taken its toll on her body, but not her will. "All right," he said at last. "Help where you can, rest when you must." A single nod was her only acknowledgement, but he saw how her shoulders eased. From that day forward, she wove herself into the rhythm of the ranch. She rose early, rekindled the hearth, swept out the mud Annie tracked in, brushed down the horses with a tenderness that made even the skittish mare settle. Annie followed her everywhere, a small shadow with big questions. "Is this how your people braid rope? Why do the trees bend more on the east side? Did you live near the mountains?" Onatah answered with patience. Sometimes her responses were simple. Sometimes a story slipped into her voice, soft as dusk. Calder would pretend not to listen, but he always did. Summer arrived in gusts of dry heat. The three worked side by side repairing fences, clearing brush, carrying buckets of water to the garden. Calder noticed how Onatah moved with the land rather than against it, how she paused to feel the wind, how she touched the earth before planting anything into it. He also noticed the small things she did for Annie, tucking a wildflower behind the girl's ear, teaching her to read bird tracks, folding her blankets with quiet care. These gestures rooted themselves in places Calder didn't realize still existed inside him. One evening, as the sun dipped low, the three of them sat at the table finishing a modest supper. Annie cut paper shapes again. Stars, circles, little snowflakes with uneven edges. Onatah watched silently for a moment before asking, "This Christmas, Annie says it is when white people celebrate light and color in winter. Why did I see none of it here last season?" Calder froze. Annie's scissors stilled in her hand. It was a simple question, asked without judgment. But it cracked open a room that had been locked for 3 years. Annie looked down at her paper. "We used to have a tree," she whispered. "Mama and I made garlands. She loved Christmas." Onatah's gaze shifted to Calder. His jaw tightened before he spoke. "After Margaret died, I couldn't keep those things in the house." His voice held the scrape of a man who had buried the truth beneath routine. Lights, songs, decorations. It all made the house feel emptier. "I didn't want Annie seeing me break." Annie quietly added, "Papa tried. He made stew. He told stories. But the house stayed dark." The silence that followed was not cold. It was tender, painful, human. Onatah lowered her eyes, absorbing this truth. A home painted in the colors of grief. A father trying to be enough. A child waiting for light to return. Softly, she said, "Among my people. Winter is not when things die. It is when they sleep, waiting to rise when hearts are ready to welcome them again." Her words drifted through the room like warm smoke. Calder swallowed hard. He didn't trust himself to speak. But Annie reached across the table and touched Onatah's hand with a fragile smile. In that moment, Calder saw something shift not only in Annie, but in himself. Onatah had not brought Christmas into the house, but she had brought a different kind of light, one that did not demand celebration, only acceptance. Their days settled into a quiet harmony. Calder found himself watching her more often, how she loosened her hair at dusk, how she stood at the edge of the pasture as if listening for something in the wind, how she spoke so gently to Annie that the girl's laugh began returning in soft bursts. Feelings stirred where he'd long assumed only ashes remained. He did not speak them. She did not ask. That was enough, for now. Autumn spread itself across Red Hawk Basin in shades of burnished gold, the kind of color that softened even the hardest memories. The wind no longer carried winter's bite, only a crispness that whispered of change. For Calder Brooks, the season brought a quiet unease he couldn't name. For Onatah, it stirred the remnants of dreams she hadn't dared revisit since her world shattered. By mid-October, the ranch breathed differently, Annie laughed more freely, and Calder found himself listening for the sound of Onatah's footsteps the same way he once listened for Margaret's humming. Onatah felt it too, the strange, fragile thread binding the three of them. But threads could snap, and she had lived a life where anything gentle never stayed for long. That afternoon, while Onatah hung herbs to dry along the porch beams, she sensed the shift in the wind, a heaviness, a memory, a warning. She turned, scanning the horizon, her breath catching when she saw a rider emerging from the dust. A man, a hat pulled low, and a gait she recognized with a jolt like cold water. Franklin Boyd. Her heart stuttered painfully. He wasn't from the mountains or the plains. He was from a different part of her story, a part she wished she could bury in the scorched earth where her people had died. Months before the attack, Franklin had lingered near her village under the pretense of trading. He spoke softly but watched her too closely, offering promises that tasted like poison. "Come with me," he once said. "I can take you somewhere. This world won't waste you." She remembered the way he'd reached for her wrist, the hunger in his eyes. She had pulled back, telling him she belonged to her people, to her own life. He had smiled then, but it wasn't a kind smile. It was a smile that said, "You will regret turning away from me." When her village burned days later, Franklin was nowhere. He had disappeared as if he'd always been a shadow instead of flesh. Now he returned, gaze locked on her with smug certainty. She backed toward the door. Calder stepped out before she could speak, jaw tightening at the sight of the stranger. Annie peeked from behind him, gripping his sleeve. Franklin tugged off his gloves with practiced ease. "Well now," he drawled, voice too smooth for the tension in the air. "Looks like the runaway bird found herself a new nest." Calder's expression hardened. "State your business." "My business." Franklin's eyes gleamed with cold amusement. "A lady and I had an understanding. She was supposed to come with me. She vanished instead. Imagine my surprise hearing she chose to hide out with some lonely rancher. Lonely." The words sliced deeper than Calder expected. Onatah felt something twist inside her anger. Fear. Shame she didn't deserve. There was no understanding. She said, voice steady, "I told you no." Franklin's smile sharpened. Maybe you forgot what you promised when your people were alive, but I remember. Calder stepped between them fully now. She isn't going anywhere with you. Franklin tilted his head. Funny, last I checked, she belongs to no one. She doesn't, Calder said, which means she chooses where she stays. Annie slipped her hand into Onatah's. Onatah squeezed it gently, the simple contact giving her a strength she thought she had lost. Franklin's eyes narrowed at the gesture. She chooses him. A stranger, when I offered her everything, Onatah stepped out from behind Calder. You offered me a cage made of sweet-smelling words, she said. I saw the bars, even if you pretend they weren't there. The wind stilled. Franklin's jaw clenched. I came to take her back. You can't take what isn't yours, Calder said, and the calm in his voice was more dangerous than a shout. Franklin reached for the gun at his hip, not fully drawing, but enough to show intent. Calder moved faster. His hand hovered near his own weapon, body coiled to protect both women behind him. Boyd, I'm telling you once, leave. The silence that followed crackled with tension. Franklin studied Calder, weighing the will of a man who had already lost everything and had no intention of losing again. Finally, Franklin spat into the dirt. She'll regret choosing you, he hissed. Eyes burning into Onatah, girls like her always do. He rode off, but the promise in his voice lingered like smoke. When he disappeared over the ridge, Calder turned to Onatah. She was trembling, though her face stayed composed. You're safe, he said, softer than the wind. She shook her head. He thinks I owe him, that I ran from him into your arms. Calder stepped closer. You ran for your life, and if he comes back, he'll face me. Onatah looked at him then, with a depth that reached past fear. I do not want to run anymore. Calder felt something shift inside him, a vow forming without words. Neither of them moved. Neither needed to. The sun slid behind the ridge, casting gold across the ranch, and in that glowing silence, they understood what had changed. This was no longer a place Onatah lived in to survive. This was a place she was choosing. For 3 days after Franklin Boyd vanished over the ridge, Red Hawk Basin held its breath. The wind moved differently now, brushing the tops of the dry grass with a whisper that felt like warning rather than weather. Calder repaired the north fence with a focus that bordered on fury, driving each nail harder than required. Annie stayed close to Onatah, following her through the house and yard with quiet devotion, as if proximity could ward off whatever shadows still clung to the woman who had become her anchor. Onatah herself moved with a fragile steadiness. She worked, she cooked, she tended the horses. Yet something in her posture had changed. Fear had not returned. She had run from fear too many times to let it dictate her breath. But the memory of Franklin's voice sat inside her like a stone. At dusk, she stood often at the edge of the pasture, scanning the horizon for dust trails. She told herself she was checking the weather, but she knew better. On the evening of the third day, Calder found her there, her silhouette drawn against the fading gold of autumn. He approached without speaking. Onatah didn't turn, but she felt him. She always did. You've been looking toward the ridge every night, he said quietly. I listen to the wind, she answered. It tells me when something isn't finished. Calder came to stand beside her. Do you believe he'll come back? She considered the question longer than he expected. Finally, she said, men like Franklin come back not because they want what they lost, but because they cannot accept being refused. Calder's jaw tightened. He had known men like that, cowhands who saw women as livestock, traders who believed the frontier was a place to take whatever they wanted. Franklin carried that same bitter entitlement. But Calder also knew something else. Men like Franklin did not walk away from insult. And Calder, defending Onatah, had been insult enough. "You don't owe him anything," Calder said. "Not your past, not your fear." She looked at him then, her eyes reflecting both dusk and uncertainty. "I am tired of owing anything to the past," she whispered. "Every step I take carries ghosts. Every night I sleep, I hear the fire of my village. Sometimes," her voice faltered, "sometimes I think if I stop running, the memories will finally catch me." Calder understood more deeply than she knew. "Running doesn't stop memories," he said. "It just keeps you too tired to face them." The wind stirred her braid. For a moment, neither spoke. The quiet between them had become a language of its own, built from glances, shared chores, unspoken grief. Finally she asked, "Do you think Franklin will return?" "Yes," Calder answered honestly. "A man like that doesn't let something go. But he won't touch you, not here, not while I breathe." Her eyes widened slightly, not from fear, but from the realization of how far he was willing to stand between her and danger. She folded her arms, not defensively, but to hold in the warmth that threatened to spread through her chest. "Why?" she whispered. "Why do you care so much?" Calder opened his mouth, closed it, then drew a slow breath. "Because this house hasn't felt alive in years," he said. "Because Annie smiles again. Because when you walk through the doorway, it feels like someone brought the wind in with purpose instead of sorrow." He hesitated, looking away toward the horizon. "And because I would rather face Boyd 100 times than lose what this place has become since you walked into it." A small tremor crossed Onatah's fingers. She lowered her head, not to hide, but to breathe through the rising tide of emotion. "You speak like I did something great," she murmured, "but I have given nothing." Calder stepped closer, his voice barely above the wind. "You gave us back the sound of laughter. You gave me a reason to hope for more than survival. And you gave Annie a world that wasn't just half-lit. At that." Onatah's composure cracked, not with tears, but with a truth she had denied herself for months. "When I left the ashes of my people, I believed I had no place left, no voice, no name beyond what the wind carried. But here," her voice softened to a thread, "here I remember the earth beneath my feet." Calder reached for her hand slowly, giving her time to withdraw. She didn't. Their fingers met, curled, held. It was the first touch between them, not born from rescue or necessity, but choice. A faint voice interrupted their stillness. Papa Onatah, Annie, stood in the doorway, clutching a blanket around her small shoulders. The growing chill had driven her inside, but her eyes held worry. Calder squeezed Onatah's hand once before letting go. "We should go in," he said gently. "Inside." The fire burned low, throwing soft shadows against the walls. Annie crawled into Onatah's lap as naturally as breathing. Together they sat on the floor, wrapped in the same blanket. Calder watched from the hearth, lost in the sight of them, two pieces of his fractured life fitting together as if they had always belonged in the same frame. "I heard you talking," Annie murmured sleepily. "Is he coming back?" "The bad man." Onatah brushed the girl's hair behind her ear. "If he does, he will find me stronger than before, and Papa will send him away," Annie said. "Certain." Onatah glanced at Calder. He met her gaze with a promise that needed no words. Annie leaned her head against Onatah's chest, her small voice drifting upward. "Are you staying for winter again?" The question held more weight than the child could understand. Calder waited, breath caught. Onatah did not answer right away. Her fingers traced the edge of the talisman on her wrist, the feather carved with symbols of her people, symbols of journeys, endings, and rebirths. At last she whispered, "I am tired of running, little one. I want to stay where the wind does not chase me." Annie smiled in her sleep. Calder closed his eyes briefly, as if the words had struck a chord too deep. Later, when the child was in bed, Calder and Onatah remained by the fire. They spoke little, but each shared silence felt more truthful than anything spoken aloud. Finally, Calder said, "If he returns, we'll face him together, not as strangers, as people who chose to stand with each other." Onatah looked into the flames, their light reflected in her dark eyes. "Together," she repeated, letting the words settle into her bones. Outside, autumn deepened. Inside, a fragile peace formed not as an ending, but as the calm before the winter that would test everything they had grown to mean to one another. Winter returned to Red Hawk Basin with a quieter step than the year before. Snow drifted down in small, deliberate flakes, layering the hills in a soft white hush. The storm that once threatened Onatah's life now felt like a distant echo, replaced by something steadier, something that grew, day after day, in the warmth of the Brooks ranch house. On the morning of Christmas Eve 1812, Calder woke to a sound he had not heard in years. Laughter. Not sharp or startled, but the gentle, bubbling kind that fills rooms. He followed the sound to the parlor and paused in the doorway. Annie stood on a stool, draping a garland of dried berries around a small pine tree. Her face bright with a joy Calder had believed lost with Margaret. Beside her, guiding her hands, was Onatah. The scene held him still, the two figures framed by soft amber firelight, snow falling beyond the frosted window. It was the kind of moment he once feared he would never see again. Annie spotted him and waved, "Papa, look! We made a tree." Calder approached slowly, almost reverently. "I see that." Onatah stepped back, allowing him to take in the sight. "She wanted to decorate it the way her mother taught her," she said quietly. So I listened. There was more behind her words. She had listened to Annie, to the house, to the memories buried in its walls. She had helped restore something Calder did not realize he'd been guarding too tightly. "You didn't have to do this," he murmured. "I know." Her gaze held his. "That is why I did." Annie hopped down from the stool and tugged at Calder's sleeve. "We saved the top ornament for you." Calder lifted her into his arms. "Which one?" Onatah held out a small wooden carving, a star, smooth and pale, clearly shaped by careful hands. "Annie told me your people place a symbol of light at the top, so I made one." Calder stared at it. The carving was simple, but something about its surface, the faint imprint of a thumb, the tiny groove where a tool had slipped, made his chest ache. "You made this?" Onatah nodded once. "Light belongs to those who seek it." He placed the star on the highest branch while Annie clapped her hands. Thrilled by the ritual she thought she had lost forever. When the ornament settled, the entire tree seemed to shift, transformed by that single point of brightness. As afternoon folded into evening, they shared a modest feast, nothing extravagant, just stew, warm bread, and the quiet joy of belonging. Annie talked until she grew drowsy, recounting every story she remembered about past winters. Calder listened with a tenderness that surprised him. Later, when Annie fell asleep on a pile of quilts near the fire. Calder and Onatah stepped outside. The night was clear. Stars pricked the sky like scattered embers, and the silence of the basin wrapped around them. Calder exhaled, watching his breath drift into the cold air. Last year, this night felt like a grave, he said. Tonight, it doesn't. Onatah's eyes lifted to the ridge, where moonlight brushed the snow-dusted pines. Winter does not kill, she said softly. It asks us to rest, to remember, to choose what we carry forward. He looked at her then, not as a savior or a wounded woman or a storm survivor, but as the heartbeat of the home he thought he'd lost. I want you to stay, he said. The truth finally unbound. Onatah turned to him fully, for a moment. The cold wind paused, as if waiting. I stayed long before you asked. She answered, a simple truth, a vow without ceremony. Calder reached out, brushing a strand of hair from her cheek. She leaned into the touch lightly, not surrendering, not clinging, but accepting. Inside, the fire crackled and flickered against the windows, reflecting three silhouettes that now belonged to one another. As the snow continued to fall, soft and unhurried, the ranch glowed with a warmth unseen since Margaret's passing, and atop the little pine tree, Onatah's wooden star caught the firelight, casting a silent beacon over the room, a symbol not of things returned, but of things newly made, from that Christmas forward. People who rode past Red Hawk Basin said the Brooks Ranch looked different, not louder, not brighter, but as if light had found its way home.